Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for attending this session that we've got, and a warm welcome to the presentation here by Sandhill Consultants. And what we're going to be doing is coupling our presentation, which is going to be looking at achieving regulatory compliance using a model-driven enterprise architecture approach. And if I introduce ourselves, my name is Jog Raj, and I'm one of the senior enterprise architects consultants here at Sandhill. Joining me today is my colleague Steve Dillon, who is a principal tools consultant, and we've also got Sophie Elbred, who's one of the marketing personnel, who's been kind enough to organise and manage this event for us. And if you're not already aware of Sandhill, basically Sandhill Consultants is a worldwide organisation. We've got offices here in the UK and also over in North America, and we basically provide a number of different types of consultancy services, focusing predominantly on the erwin product range, but also looking at project portfolio management solutions as well. And just for your records, this session is being recorded and will be available for download after the end of the session. The slides also will be made available to the attendees. And our intention is here to run through the presentation, and we've allowed time for answering any questions at the end of the session. But obviously, if you've got any urgent questions that you want to have answered immediately, then just please use the chat room to raise your questions, and my colleagues will do their best to answer the questions as we go along. So if, as I was saying, you're not already aware of who Erwin is, and also Sandhill, Erwin itself is one of the most trusted data names, or trusted names in the data modeling area, and has been so for the last 30 years. But of recent, it's also expanded its portfolio to including the other areas of enterprise architecture and business process modeling through a number of acquisitions that it has recently made. And that extends the portfolio and the capabilities that we've got. And we're going to utilize some of those additional capabilities that are in that portfolio and look at how we can use those to help us address the issues of compliance. So in terms of what we're going to do for the overall presentation, what I'm basically going to do is just give you a very, very brief overview of GDPR. This is not intended to be a session of what is GDPR. There are plenty of other sources out there. And what we're really interested in doing is how can we actually use the solution sets that we've got here to help us to achieve compliance. And as part of that, what we're going to do is to introduce some organizational structures that we've got. And by organizational structures, I mean compliance processes and frameworks, and to organize the content of the compliance work and the assets that we create in order to be able to demonstrate compliance. And as part of that, as I was saying, we're going to use the erwin product portfolio, but the approach that we're taking here is quite generic in there. And we're going to finish off with some of the services that we can offer as Sandhill, and also a question and answer session for us towards the end. Yeah. And the idea really is in the presentation is what we're looking to do is to see how can we achieve compliance using a structured model-driven enterprise architecture rather than some sort of ad hoc process to sort of guide people. Yeah. So that's really the intention here. And if you're asking yourself, well, you know, why is it necessary? Well, you know, if you take a look and do a research, or take a look on Google and do a search, you'll find that there are quite regular occurrences of where there have been data breaches, and they're the ones that make the headlines because you know, they can tend to be quite significant events in there. And there are a few which are quite well known. But the ones that aren't quite so well known are incidents where people get fined because they have failed to comply with the data protection laws, because it wasn't quite clear how they collected the data and what they were actually doing with that data. So it's not actually just a case of incidents and occasions when data breaches have taken place, but also those where people have failed to take proper care of the usage of the data that they've collected. And so we have here in the UK the Information Commissioner's Office that are responsible for enforcing the regulatory compliance laws, specifically here within the UK. And you know, why is this all important? Well, you know, this is very important because the impact of any of these breaches or violations is that it has an impact on the reputation of the organization or the entity or the enterprise that's involved. And that in itself means that the faith that a person has in dealing with that particular enterprise diminishes. And therefore that has a direct impact down the line in terms of the products that they may acquire or the services that they may acquire or may not acquire. And so it has an impact on the bottom line in there. And one of the other things that we've also realized as we've been going through these type of exercises and looking at the data breaches and the data violations is the fact that it looks like that we are never ever going to be in a position where we can claim to be perfectly safe and fully protected. So it's always going to be a case of, well, how far can we actually eliminate the risk? How far can we actually reduce it and make it to achieve a point in time where it's actually acceptable as a minimum level of risk? And it's always a trade-off between the risk and the cost of complying with having a fully fledged, fully non-risk environment. So in terms of an overview of GDPR, well, you know, to state the obvious, and you can see this from the GDPR acronym, which is the General Data Protection Regulations, and that itself gives it all away. And the fact that it's about the data. Don't forget, it's about the data. It's not about necessarily the regulations, it's about the data that we're handling in there. And GDPR has really been conceived to strengthen European citizens' rights in the digital era and make it easier for businesses to comply. And basically, it's an attempt to end the fragmentation of the European data protection laws and provide a single law for all of the European Union member states. And for those of you sitting abroad and not in Europe or in the UK, and you're thinking, well, what's that got to do with us? Well, even though GDPR is a European matter at first glance, it actually has a global reach, because what it means is that if there's any enterprise, any organization that collects and or processes data that is relevant to the data subjects in the UK, in the EU, then those GDPR regulations need to comply. So that means that you need, if you're going to deal with any enterprise or any person who's resident in the European Union, you need to make sure that you're GDPR compliant. And also in terms of its enforcement, what it does mean is that even though it hasn't come into enforcement at the moment, it's due for next year, it does mean that even instances where you are collecting information now outside of the enforcement of the GDPR means that when it does come into play and into force, it does mean that retrospectively the GDPR regulations will apply to all the data that you've already collected. So you can't just simply sit there and say, right, it was collected before they came into play. You still have to show compliance with the GDPR regulations. So the point about that is, well, don't worry or think about, well, the GDPR enforcement date is sometime off in the future. It's something that you really need to start looking at right now and making sure that you are compliant, because at that point in time, you need to be able to demonstrate that you're actually in compliance. So what are we talking about when we're looking at the scope of the GDPR? So what we're interested in is looking at the processing of personal data. That's the data of the individuals. And that means the processing in the of the individuals in the EU, as well as offerings to the EU. So if you're buying something from abroad, well, then you're subject to GDPR. And if you're looking at how people behave and what searches they do and what associated searches they do as a consequence of that, behavioral tracking, well, that is data that you're collecting. And if it's about data subjects in the EU, then the GDPR rules also apply in there. And obviously, given all the facts that we have dispersed data all across the globe now, then the data transfer from the European Union to the non-European countries, yeah, that's still applicable. So we still have to apply GDPR rules to that. And so there are a number of different terms that people do talk about, and that one of those is the data subject, which I've already mentioned, and that's a natural individual of the EU member nations. Now, a data controller is quite an important person, because what they do is they say and they define what personal data we are collecting, what's going to be done with it, and ultimately they are the people who are responsible for defining how the data is collected and how it's handled. And then also we have a data processor, and the data processor is the person or the entity which actually acts on behalf of the controller and processes the data. Now, to comply with the GDPR, those data controllers, they must always be able to demonstrate the legal basis for collecting data. Why did they need it? Yeah, what were they going to do with it? And what's the purpose of it? And whether to disclose the data to anybody else in there. And generally to make, because they are the custodians of the data, generally to make sure that they are compliant with the duties which are afforded to the individual, the data subject, but also the compliance regulations themselves as well. So it's the responsibility of the data controller to demonstrate compliance, as I say, to both the interested parties that are in there. So how do we go about achieving compliance? Well, one of the problems that we've got is that out there's an awful lot of areas and systems and places where we've got data being handled, yeah? And, you know, basically in a world of portable data, it can be with geographically distributed processing centers, lots of different workforces and customer bases. But on top of that, there's also overlapping jurisdictions. You know, you've got your in-country regulations, you've got your European regulations, then you've got your own international regulations which might apply. And, you know, making sense of that and making sure that you are compliant with it is a bit of a challenge, yeah? And the first thing that I do want you to be aware of in trying to address this issue is that this is actually a business issue. And addressing the compliance needs is about understanding what data you've got, what processes handle that data, what governance systems apply to that data and the processes, and making sure that you've got documentation and reports to be able to demonstrate compliance and implement compliance. And it's not about technology, so it's not about the systems themselves. Yeah, it's about the business being aware of the fact that it's got personal data that it's handling, and being able to demonstrate that it's handling the data according to the processes and the governance regulations that apply. And so for that, what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to understand and document what data you have, what data is being stored where, what processes and policies apply, and be fully aware of what national and international regulations apply to handling that data. So that's knowing what you're supposed to be doing, but you also have to do what you say. So it's not just about saying it, but you've got to actually implement it. And that means implementing the regulations proactively. And that means any processes and systems that we're handling, that we are actually implementing the data compliance in there by design. So the systems are designed so you're not assuming that a person has given your authorization. It has to be implicit authorization to handle particular data. Yeah, and it's not a case of simply being the default position saying, yeah, we assume this. You have to say, we assume that we haven't been given permission, and you have to seek permission. Yeah, so doing it by default in there. And obviously any processes and systems that we put into place, then of course we have to monitor those for continuous compliance with that, because obviously as business evolves and develops new situations, then we've got to be continuously out there to make sure that we are fully compliant in there. And so that's actually knowing what we want to do and doing it, but also we have to demonstrate that, yes, we are compliant with that. And that means that we need to be able to do internal audits, internally to say, yes, we are compliant with that, but also be prepared to show that we are compliant to external auditing bodies as and when the needs arise. But more so than that, we also have to be able to share the thinking about the need for regulatory compliance internally. So that means sharing information about the sensitive data, types of data that we're handling, and making sure that people are fully aware of that is data that we need to be handling sensitively and carefully in there. So the challenge, as I was saying, is always to get a handle on the data, understand what you've got, finding the data, and how it's actually being used in there. So when we're looking at the data, what we need to be able to do is to break it down into more manageable chunks. And to break it down, we want to understand what data we've got in there, how it's being handled, where it's being handled, who's looking at it, who's using it, when is it being used, and very importantly, why are we collecting that data? You know, what purpose does it serve? There has to be a particular purpose rather than just ad hoc collection of data just in case at some point in time it proves useful for us. Well, we can't do that. We have to have an explicit purpose and a reason why we're collecting that data. So when we're looking at understanding what we've got, the what components of what we've got is mapping into the data architecture. The how components are the applications and the processes that we've got. The where information that we collect is the networks where we're handling this. The who component of the aspects of the enterprise maps to the security architecture. Who has the right to look at this information? Who has the right to be able to use it, etc. And the others, okay, when are we handling this information? And obviously, again, back again, why are we collecting that information? Why are we processing it? Is it lawful to be able to do that? So it's very important that we can understand and break down the understanding of the enterprise into more manageable chunks. And this is one way that we can do that. So what are we trying to do when we're trying to achieve compliance? Well, there's a number of things that we're trying to do. First of all, in any enterprise that exists, there is a chain of steps that we're going through. And that chain of steps is looking at adding value to either the end user or to our internal needs. And that particular value chain, we have to preserve the value at each stage in the processing of that. Yeah? But when we're looking at that value chain, we also have to be able to show that any compliance that we've got, yes, we are also in compliance with the regulatory compliance needs as well. And so that means that there might be risks that we've got in there. And what we don't want to do is to break the value chain. What we want to do is enforce the value chain that we've got and add on to it the need to be able to show at any point in time, yes, that we are in regulatory compliance in there. And so what we have to be able to do is to be able to, as we're enforcing and applying our regulatory compliance needs, is to be able to detect and determine is there any types of risks that we've got where we're handling the data. And then we need to be able to classify that risk, you know, how important is it? But also we have to provide some sort of valuation on that risk. And by valuation, I don't necessarily mean in terms of monetary valuation, but what I'm talking about is, well, what's the potential that that the risk exposes? You know, it's the probability versus the possibility. And we then, once we have an understanding of the degree of the risk, yeah, what steps can we take to mitigate that risk occurring in there? And as I was saying, what we have to be able to do is to go through that and show we are in compliance, but also limit any unintended consequences of the actions that we take to achieve the compliance in there. So simply, you know, the fact that we've got a piece of data that we've collected doesn't give us carte blanche justification for using it for other unintended purposes. Yeah? So we have to be aware of that. So how are we going to go along and actually achieve our compliance in there? As I was saying, you know, there are ad hoc ways of forms and things of doing this, but what we're presenting here is a generic approach that we can take. And one or a number of components of this generic approach is, well, yes, we need some sort of organizational structure to be able to organize the policies that we've got, the procedure that we want to follow, the principles that we want to follow, the regulations that we're going to follow. So there's going to be a number of privacy management things that we can manage in there. Yeah. And having some sort of framework and classification to be able to organize that content. And yes, we can organize the content a little bit along the lines that I was talking about, the what, the who, the how, the where, and the why, etc. Yeah. But on top of that, we also need a process that we can follow. And what this process says is, well, first of all, you need to know the data. You know, without the data, it's a pointless exercise. So collect the data. So we need to understand what data we've got. Well, where are the business systems that are using that data? Well, we need a catalog of the systems, because the data on its own doesn't tell us anything or doesn't do anything. It's what we do with it in terms of the processes and the systems that we use as part of those processes that we follow. Yeah? So we need to have a systems catalog or an inventory of that. Then what we need is, if we haven't already got it, is a process flow which says, okay, in this particular scenario or use case, these are the steps that we follow, these are the pieces of data that we collect, and these are the systems that we use. So having that as a basis enables us to go back and actually conduct a data flow audit. And that data flow audit says, right, at this point in time, I'm collecting this information. Is it lawful? Can I do what I want with it? Can I use it for other purposes? So at each point in time when we're processing that data, we are given the opportunity to assess that are we in compliance with the regulations in there. And once we've made an assessment, we can compare that with what we're supposed to have done and come up with a gap analysis and determine what's the gap that needs to fill. And obviously that gap itself is the risk, and the greater the risk, yeah, the more attention that we need to pay to this. And once we've identified any gaps in that, well, how are we going to fix it? Once we've fixed it, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to continuously monitor the situations and audit those and improve and go around and round again. And it's not a one-off exercise, it's going to be a repeat exercise as the regulations will change, as the business processes change, your systems, the needs of the enterprise itself changes in there. So what we're advocating is that, yes, we need some framework to organize and structure our content, we need processes to follow, and to accelerate and speed up the compliance, we ideally should be using tools and techniques to help us to facilitate the compliance in there. And whilst we're talking about the general compliance here, yeah, there are lots of regulations, you know, so the approach that we're following here is a generic one rather than specific to GDPR or any other regulation that you may be familiar with. So if we go and look at the process that I was talking about, well, how are we going to follow that process? Well, you know, the fact is that there is a proliferation of data everywhere. You know, the data itself is hidden across your production systems, your business intelligence and the analytics systems, in test and development environments, in secondary storage systems for backup and disasters recovery. It sits in the cloud. And so this fragmentation of the data stores makes it very difficult to get an overview of the data and to manage that efficiently. You know, we often talk about the sort of islands of data. And this fragmentation of these data stores makes it difficult to get an overview. And what we need is a single consolidated data view that helps us to understand the data landscape. And we need that then to help us to define and drive the policy across the data estate. And that's for both content that we've got on premises as well as off premises as well. And then as we understand that data landscape, then we're in a position to be able to say, yes, this is what we need to do to treat this particular data. You know, is it personally identifiable information? Is it sensitive information? And to treat that accordingly and build that into the processes that we're following and the systems that we're using to support those processes. So with that note, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Steve, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that we can start looking at that data.
Thanks, Jog. So the data we need to catalogue is evident in two realms. Firstly, the business realm, the language used in the operation of the enterprise. And secondly, in the IT realm. So these are labels used in physical data stores and models that represent and document them. So they're differentiated here in the business terms in green and the data elements in red. Now, not all business terms relate to data elements. They may relate to organizational structure, process, policy, and not all data elements have corresponding business terms. For example, those things that are internal to IT systems, such as IDs, flags, timestamps. So we need to identify those common elements where there's a relationship between business terms and data elements. Our objective is twofold. Firstly, to be able to trace the usage of key business terms across the data landscape. And secondly, to be able to understand the business significance of the data that we process. We can do this concurrently from the top down and from the bottom up. We can start in the business realm, top down, to catalogue and classify business terms, then further describe the relationships between those terms in business data models. At the same time, we can catalogue and classify data elements that we actually store in our databases. The logical model can be used to identify those data elements critical to the enterprise, depicting data elements in a way that can be readily mapped back to business terms. erwin data governance tooling allows us to build business glossaries to define, classify, and cross-relate our business terms. erwin data modeling tool allows us to catalog data we already store through reverse engineering. Physical data models reverse engineered directly from the database will tell us about the inheritance structure of our database, but will mostly have unintelligible names and few descriptions. We need to have more data about these data, i.e. metadata. Examining the usage of the data within the application context will allow us to enhance this metadata and construct logical data models incorporating this contextual information. Once we know what the data represent, we can ascertain whether it's impacted by the legislation and classify it accordingly using data modeling features such as data domains, user-defined properties, etc. This is the big picture we're aiming for. This diagram shows two types of lineage, referred to here as semantic lineage, depicted in green. You can view this top down as the usage of our business terms, or bottom up as providing definitions for our data elements. Also represented here is data movement lineage, documenting flow and transformation of our data across the data landscape. erwin data governance tools allow us to create these semantic and data flow mappings. Then, having created these mappings, we can trace the usage of terms with a particular classification, or check the definition of a data element to see if it's impacted by the regulation. And with that, I'll hand you back to Jog.
Great, thank you very much for that, Steve. So, as you can see, if we have an understanding of our business terms and the data terms, great, that's what we need to know. What's the data that we're handling, and what's the metadata of that data that we are handling in here, and knowing about it. But again, remember what I was saying is that we need to understand the context in which that data itself is being used. Yeah? And one way that we can do this to understand the context, because it's the context that actually provides the sort of the knowledge and the wisdom of what that data is actually being used for. And what we need to understand in that context is the mission, what's the enterprise trying to do with that particular data, or trying to achieve generally, yeah? What are the processes it's handling? What are the business systems that it's using? And what's the organizational people and the roles and the skill, well, not skills, but the roles and the authorizations for handling the data that they've got in there. And based on our understanding of that, combined with the data, provides us with an opportunity to create some insights for informed decision making about how that metadata and the data is being handled in here. And so what we are able to do is to use a capability, and that is a thing called a capability. The capability itself defines the collective functionality that can be applied to achieve a particular outcome. Yeah. And it describes it from the enterprise's viewpoint of what it needs to be able to do to achieve its business and fulfill its mission and obligations in there. But from our point of view, these things called capabilities are what the enterprise does, and it's got some dimensions in there, and these capabilities are handling data. And these capabilities then give us an opportunity to be able to go out and say, well, you know, where do I start on my business? I need a structured way of being able to target where I need to look at my regulation and compliance and my data compliance needs in there. As I say, you can do it in an ad hoc manner, or we can do a structured approach. And using the capability ones, or the capability approach, is a very structured approach which says, let's start looking at some of the capabilities. Maybe what we can do with those is to classify those into those that give us strategic support or give us a competitive advantage. There may be others which are absolutely essential to the running of the business but don't confer any financial gain in there, and similarly with a business necessity. And so again, what we're able to do is to take those capabilities and produce high-level heat maps which can identify areas of interest. And so here's a bit of a screenshot using the Erwin Agile products here, which is showing the capabilities with heat maps in there. And they're showing some of the areas that maybe we should be focusing on and important as a way to focus on specific areas where we need to be able to show the compliance and basically show the compliance in there. So if we take those capability areas, again, remember what we were talking about is that the what maps the data, the how of the capabilities maps the systems, the where is the networks, the who is the security, etc. Yeah, and so again, we're mapping it back and saying, in our capability, these are the other components of that capability that we're trying to understand. Yeah. And having an understanding of that goes back to, well, yes, here's the systems that are going to support it, here's the data that's going to support it, etc. So we need to understand the architectures of the capabilities. And so again, if you remember back when I was talking about the process that we're going to follow, okay, we've now got our data, but the next step in here is that we want to catalog our systems inventories. So the systems inventories of the business systems is the applications that we've got, the business services that we've got, the interfaces, the application services that we have, any integrations, basically the business systems that exist to support the needs of the business. And those can be gathered either from, you know, any application repositories that we may have, which may be the CMDB or ITSM repositories. They may be from models that we've got, or drawings and pictures that we've got in PowerPoint or Visio, or in Excel and Word sheets. And if the worst comes to the worst and we haven't got anything in, to revert to, we'll have to create questions and questionnaires and conduct interviews and find out from people what systems they're actually using. Either way, what we need to be able to do is to document what business systems that we've got. Again, as part of the process flow that we're following, we also need to understand the processes that people are following. So when they are looking at the value chains that they are implementing, what are the steps, what are the decision points that they're following in there, and document those, but not just documenting the process flows, but also at which point in time, what data are we dealing with? And as part of that dealing of the data, well, at what point in time are we creating data? And what point in time are we updating and reading it? And obviously, don't forget, we also need to understand what point in time are we deleting data as well. Yeah? So we need to correlate that data with the processes, because it's only by understanding what we're doing with that process at a what we're doing with the data at a particular point in time of that process, are we able to start asking questions later on to say, well, is that a legitimate use of that data? And to be able to demonstrate and enforce compliance in there. So we need to document the process flows, and we should be focusing on those that are going to be processes which are handling sensitive data, and to understand what happens to that data as it goes through the business systems and through the processes in here, and use that later on to demonstrate that yes, we are in compliance, as well as using it to implement and enforce our compliance requirements. But not only are we interested in the points at which we are handling the data, but we also want to understand who is responsible for defining who is actually responsible for defining which pieces of data we're collecting. So we can also have data accountability, and we can look at who is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed for that data. And so as part of the enterprise, we may have the data steward who's responsible for content, the data modeler who's responsible for, or is rather consulted on this. The enterprise architect is the one who designs the piece of data that we're using. Yeah? And there may be others like business analysts who are informed that they can use that particular piece of data. So these are points where we are able to go back and say, if there's a violation or there's some sort of change in accountability, we can go back to responsible authorities in there and to make sure that they are aware of any limitations or requirements that we have for the data that we're looking at. Okay, so we've got our data, we've got our systems, we've got our processes. Well, how do we measure what are the compliance needs that we've got? So some of the privacy principles that we need to apply in here are, is the data being handled lawfully? Yeah, is it fair? Is it transparent? Is it fit for the purpose that we originally started collecting that data? Yeah, is it the minimum set of data that we're handling in there? Is it accurate and up to date? How long are we storing it for? Yeah, and is it being kept in a form which is secure and confidential? And also to make sure that there are people in there who are accountable in there. So that means that as we've got those principles and as we've got the data flows, we can run through the data flows and we can start asking questions in there. At each point in time of the process flows, yeah, we can start analyzing it. Some of the questions that we need to ask in there, again, for the privacy principles, is the information that we're handling, is it inaccurate, insufficient, or out of date, fit for purpose? Are we keeping it for the right period of time? Is it relevant? Are we disclosing and making it available to the right people? Are we transmitting it correctly? Are we using it in the way that we said? And so the idea here is that we go through and walk through the process flow that we've got, consider each one of those privacy principles and the rules and the requirements of the regulations, and ask at each point in time, are we complying with those privacy principles? Yeah. And at each point in time, then for the process and for the data and the systems, we can start recording our findings for any compliance or non-compliance or degrees of compliance issues in there. And so we can start marking up the models and the information that we've got. And what that actually does, it means is that we can then start using that to help us to analyze the processes we've got, the data that we're handling, and the systems. And we can start doing some analysis and provide us with insights in here. So for those privacy rules, we've got rules numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. We've got these particular processes which are handling the data. And what's the degree of compliance? Well, so we've got a customer name as a data. Well, it looks like we're not handling that very well in terms of the processes that are looking at that data in there. Whereas with the vehicle registration data that we've got in there, yeah, it looks like that's pretty well being handled in there. But the point being is that we're able to perform, as part of the data impact analysis audit, an assessment of the degree of compliance against the regulations and against the compliance needs, and have scorecards and reports which help us to focus in on the important areas that we should really be focusing in on. And this also serves as a way of providing reports which say, well, we started off 6 months ago with this degree of compliance, and now we've managed to achieve an improved degree of compliance in there. So as we're working along, we're able to demonstrate internally the progress that we are actually making as well. So if we identify areas that are deficient, well, what are we actually going to do about that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to be proactive, not reactive. So we're not waiting for a data breach to happen. What we need to be able to do is to have preventative processes, preventative systems in place, and audits which identify issues of non-compliance and make sure that we are implementing and designing it into the systems and the data so that these data breaches or violations don't occur. And so that's what we mean by the fact that we've got to design the processes and systems to be compliant by default, meaning that we don't assume that somebody has given us the authorization to handle the data in a particular way. We have to explicitly go out and ask Yeah, so we have to design it in there to make sure that it isn't assumed that we've got authorization in there. And obviously, it does apply not just to the collection of the data, but through to the entire life cycle, where what we're talking about is collecting or throughout the entire life cycle from the beginning to the end in there. Okay, so if we now have an understanding of the data, the processes, and the systems, well, then we can start looking at the systems that we've got and say, okay, we've got these systems, there's some deficiencies within there, we need to be able to handle, or we need to be able to change those systems to be able to handle the data that we want. And so this is the current landscape of the applications that we've got. We've got to change that to handle, to make sure that we're compliant. Here's the future state. Yeah, so we've got new applications which are going to be improved or variations of the existing ones. Yeah, and the idea there is that we are handling any deficiencies and designing those and building up new systems to be able to handle that. Which means that we're proposing changes to our application portfolio and as part of the process of mitigating the risk for compliance. And so we can propose new applications, and again, using some of the tools that we've got, we can have Kanbans which say, well, here's my new application, and it's in a state of proposed because we're proposing it to overcome some of the limitations that we've identified as part of the regulation compliance. Yeah, and we can start planning for the portfolio of applications we've got in there. And once we've identified the applications that need improvement, yeah, then as I was saying, what we need to be able to do is, as we're designing the applications and the process and systems, we have to build in privacy into the systems in there. You know, remember the privacy principles that we had is got to be designed in by default and designed into the process. That's what we need to be able to do. That's a larger subject and topic of how we go about doing that outside of this. But the point is, yes, we have to build that in, yeah, into the processes and the data and systems, etc. So that meant when we were looking at achieving the compliance, what I was showing you is the fact that we needed a framework, and the framework is looking at, again, looking at the policies, the procedures, the privacy management principles that we're going to follow, how we're going to structure the understanding of the enterprise in terms of the data that it handles, the processes, the people, the systems, the capabilities, yeah, and then applying a process to follow, and as part of that, adopting and using tools to accelerate and make it easier to show and achieve compliance in there. And of course, then once we're able to do that, yeah, then it's a continuous improvement of monitoring, auditing, and improving those processes in there. So what we've seen today then really is that, you know, if you happen to be dealing with data subjects that are resident in the European Union, then you need to be able to do, you need to be able to understand and document what data you've got, how the data is being handled, what processes and policies you're following, what regulations you're following, both local and national. Yeah. Then you need to be able to go in and be able to proactively look at those processes, the systems, and be able to design those processes and make sure that you're implementing a compliance in accordance with those by design and as default, yeah, and continuously monitor for the compliance. But as I was saying earlier, it's not just enough to be able to do that. You also have to make sure that both your internal people know what processes are in place, what data is sensitive, what data needs to be handled sensitively, yeah, and they need to be aware of the systems and the processes that you've put into place for compliance and to follow those. But also the same sets of processes, systems you've got in place can be used to show for external purposes, for our external regulation, you know, for example, like Sarbanes-Oxley, yeah, or any other regulations that may be applicable here, to be able to demonstrate our compliance with those. Yeah. So we can use those for both internal and external demonstration of compliance in there. As I've been going through the presentation here, I've been looking at or using some screenshots and referring to some of the products in the Erwin portfolio. And so what we've been doing is we've been using the Erwin data governance tool in here, a little bit of Erwin Agile, a little bit of data modeler, and a little bit more of the enterprise architecture Agile in there. That's not to say that you've got to have the whole set of these. It's really to simply say that you should be following a process to help you achieve compliance. And if you can use tools to help you achieve that, to accelerate that, then all the better, because using the tools just makes it quicker, easier, better, and faster to demonstrate the fact that we can achieve compliance and actually achieve compliance in there. So Sandhill itself, yes, as an organization, we've got a number of people available that can provide services in a number of different areas regarding the tools and approaches in here. So we've got services, education, and training. And we've also got a number of quick starts that we can supply to people to help them get ramped up to using the tool sets and achieving their degrees of compliance in here. But all that is available for subject to discussions and yeah, further follow-up discussions with anybody. So that brings me up, really up to what, about, that's been about 45 minutes. And that means that we've got a number of questions that have been raised in here. So I'm just going to have a quick read through this, and let me see if I can answer this in here. So we've got one question in here. So, as part of citizen data, could preferences around the use of customer data be attached as individual piece of metadata to the record as identity entity, allow portability across systems, helping remediation? So, okay, so I think what that's saying is against the data is the possibility of holding some sort of additional metadata. And one of those, sorry, to answer the question, yes, you can. So as part of the setup in the data modeling capabilities that we've got is the ability to have what are called user-defined properties. So you might add in a user-defined property which says, well, is this particular attribute a personally identifiable information, and have a Boolean yes or no. And so that in itself then becomes metadata about the data which you can transfer and share with others to indicate the fact that, yes, this is a piece of data that is personally identifiable or sensitive, or it's been required for compliance with a particular regulation. Yeah. So to answer your question in that, yes, yes, we have that capability to be able to do that across systems in there. Okay, just looking at anything else. Okay, one other question that did apply, which was raised, and that was it was an interesting one and quite topical, and that is the fact that currently the UK is part of the European Union, and as everybody knows, Brexit is in progress, and what will happen if and when the UK decides to leave the European Union? Well, if you recall back to what I was saying at the beginning of the introductory slides, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. If you're dealing with any citizens or data subjects that are part of the European Union, then the GDPR regulations apply. Yeah. So you know, just because the UK is considering leaving the EU doesn't mean that the GDPR regulations won't apply. They will still continue to apply. Yeah. So you still need to be aware of them. You still need to be able to show compliance and implement any compliance needs that you may have in there. Okay, that means that we've still got about 10 minutes, which is good going. Looking at the chat, I think it doesn't look as if there are any other questions that anybody has got. So on that note, I think what we'll do is to wrap up and say, well, I'm hopeful that you have found our session useful, yeah, and that it's giving you some food for thought as to a possible approach and possible solutions to addressing your compliance needs. And if you want to follow up, then please contact either David here or Sophie, or indeed myself as well, and we will be more than happy to discuss this in further detail with you. And again, as to reiterate what I said at the beginning, the slides will be made available to the attendees after the session has concluded, as well as a recording will also be made available for you if you're interested in that as well. So without any further ado, I will give people their 10 minutes back to go and do some other important things. And on that note, again, thank you very much for attending. Thank you, and bye.